Hello, good day. Today I've got the pleasure of the company of Professor Alfred de Zayas, who's an internationally renowned legal scholar, writer, and an expert. Professor de Zayas is the Professor of International Law and History at the Geneva School of Diplomacy. Before that, he has been a UN staff legal expert for over 40 years, if I'm not mistaken. And between the years 2012 and 2018, he was appointed as the UN Independent Rapporteur on promoting equality and human rights in the international order. Professor de Zayas is also an author of several books. His latest book being, I'm just going to call this up, uh, his latest book being The Human Rights Industry, which I'm just going to struggle to get this up now, hopefully. Should come up. Yes, here we go. I hope everybody can see this. The Human Rights Industry by Alfred de Zayas, published by Clarity Press oh, sorry, I lost that one, in 2023. Uh, Also, Professor de Zayas is a prolific writer. He writes articles for, among other publications, Counterpunch, commenting on recent international developments, and there's so many of them, it's hard to keep up with. But Professor de Zayas has got such expertise and intellect. He can comment on various moving parts in the world. And that's his one, well, not his latest article, but that was an article he did in Counterpunch back in December 2024. Um, Professor de Zayas, welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Finian, for inviting me, and I'm game for whatever you want.
Okay, so let's start with the recent Trump peace plan in Gaza. Professor de Zayas, it's all over the news. Lots of people commenting on it. From what I gather, you're skeptical that it is a viable peace plan.
Well, it is not a peace plan at all. It's an ultimatum. The 20 points are a deal between the United States and Israel to maintain Israeli control of Palestine and of the Gaza Strip. Uh, we welcome a ceasefire, of course. We welcome an exchange of hostages. Hostages should not have been taken in the first place, and Hamas would have been well advised to release them at an early date. But let's go ahead with such things as exchange of prisoners.
Hmm.
But how about humanitarian aid? We've seen the bad faith of Israel that bombs the Gaza population trying to get to humanitarian aid. We've seen the bad faith of Israel trying to kill the negotiators at Doha, which is a colossal violation of international law, the sovereignty of the Qatar state, and certainly with the complicity of the United States, because the biggest United States air base in that area is in Qatar. And you're not going to tell me that the United States did not know that 12 Israeli planes were entering airspace. I mean, the United States knew that long before they entered the airspace of Qatar to bomb and try to kill, try to assassinate the negotiators. So, United States has zero credibility. United States is not an honest broker. Neither
Hmm.
is Tony Blair. I mean, it's an insult to your intelligence, to my intelligence. It's an insult to the world to even suggest that Tony Blair could play any role, whatever, in Gaza. Tony Blair should be behind bars, the same as George W. Bush, the same as all those neocons who actually revolted against international law in the year 2003 when they carried out a brazen aggression against the people of Iraq. No justification whatever,
Hmm.
massive violation of the UN Charter of Article 2, Paragraph 4, and creating a great danger for international peace and security.
Hmm.
Now, that being said, we welcome, and 40 of my colleague rapporteurs at the United Nations welcomed at least the effort to reach some sort of an end to this tragedy. But obviously, any durable solution has to be based on international law. And we have the highest judicial instance of the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, which has on repeated occasions taken position on the Palestine issue. You have the advisory opinion of the 9th of July 2004. You have the advisory opinion of the 19th of July 2024, very explicit with all of the serial violations of United Nations treaties by Israel, and with a conclusion that the occupation of Palestine and Gaza, the 17-year blockade of Gaza, the starving of the population of Gaza, all of that is illegal. The occupation is illegal. And we have now my former boss, you might say, when I was independent expert on international order, I overlapped with High Commissioner Navi Pillay. Now,
Hmm.
Navi Pillay was also now, over the last 3 years, the chair of the United Nations Independent Inquiry Commission on Palestine. And they delivered a 72-page report to the Human Rights Council during this session, the 60th session of the Council. And she concluded in these 72 pages that Israel had committed genocide, that Israel is committing genocide, and that there must be accountability. If I were to quote from her op-ed in the New York Times on the 16th of September, she published this op-ed, my UN Commission's findings: Israel is committing genocide. And she concludes very clearly: I urge every government, every leader, and every citizen to ask, what will we say when our children and grandchildren ask what we did while Gaza was burned to the ground? Every act of genocide is a test of the humanity that binds us. The prevention of genocide is not a matter of discretion of states. It is a legal and moral obligation, and it admits no delay. The law requires action. Our common humanity demands it. Now, Navi Pillay is integrity in person. I've had the honor of working with this brilliant lawyer, who, by the way, was also a judge in South Africa, and she was a judge at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. She knows what she's talking about. Going
Hmm.
back to Trump's so-called peace plan, 40 of my colleagues issued a press release on the 3rd of October. And the press release is very clear.
Yes, we
They
had that.
welcomed the idea
Hmm.
of peace in Gaza, but on the basis of those fundamental principles of international law that are anchored in the UN Charter and in countless resolutions of the General Assembly. Do not forget that Israel is a creation of the United Nations. The United Nations has a special responsibility because
Mm.
they negotiated with the Zionists back in 1947 and said, you can enter the United Nations under these conditions. Now, the fact is that Israel said it would abide by certain conditions laid out by the General Assembly, and then they threw them in the bin. Because what they have done is, since 1948, systematic undermining, violating the United Nations Charter in so many aspects, land grabbing, of course, expelling the native population of Palestine. You have the Nakba with nearly 1 million expellees. And then the General Assembly comes with Resolution 194 during its third session and says the expellees have to go back. They have a right of return. Now, the right of return is well anchored in international law, and I myself wrote two encyclopedia articles for two separate encyclopedias on the issue of forced population transfer. So, ethnic cleansing, forced population transfer is deemed to be a form of genocide, resolution of the General Assembly. But beyond that, there is a right to return. So, since Israel is a serial violation of the United Nations Charter, Article 6 of the Charter allows the General Assembly to expel Israel from membership. No country, I cannot think of any country that has violated more United Nations resolutions and United Nations decisions than the state of Israel.
Yeah.
Israel, and with the complicity of the United States, is at war
You
with
made
the UN Charter, is at war with international law. And that cannot be tolerated. So forget the idea of business as usual. I mean, Trump wants to turn the page and say, well, forget the past, look for the future, and let's have peace. But no, I mean, you
yeah.
cannot undo the crimes committed by Israeli leaders. And it is important to enforce the arrest warrants against Yoav Gallant, the former
Defense.
Minister of Defense, and against Benjamin Netanyahu. And what do we see? And that is a fault of the mainstream media in Ireland, in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, even here in Switzerland, where I currently live. The press has such manipulation of public opinion, such narratives that go against the facts, and they go against the law, and they reverse the roles. There's no doubt that in the Palestine context, uh, the aggressor, the perpetrator, is Israel. The victims have been the Palestinians, and the Palestinians have a right to resist. This right to resist is confirmed in international law, in resolutions of the General Assembly, Article 7 of Resolution 3314, for instance. They have a right to fight back
Yeah.
against an oppressor, and that must be understood. But our problem, and that applies across the board, that applies also with regard to our perception of the United Nations itself as an institution and all of
Well,
its agencies. I
Professor
mean,
Professor Desires, can I just interrupt you there because one of the very important points that you're making here is the lack of enforcement. So the UN is this beautiful document that the pinnacle of our international law, our standard. You call it the Constitution of the world. Established in 1945 after the horrors of the Second World War and the First World War before that. You have this fantastic document and commitment to principles of equality and human rights and peace and non-aggression. Uh, but for 80 years, and this is the 80th year of its anniversary, 1945 to 2025, there has been just an abject lack of enforcement, which is ties in with what you're saying about Trump's peace plan, so-called peace plan for Gaza. It's very hard to believe that there is uh, you know, uh, a genuine, serious proposition here for peace from people from parties like the United States and Israel who've been completely violating the UN Charter, as you've well surveyed there, for 8 decades almost. And this lack of enforcement gives the lie to their credibility. Um, Professor de Zayas, can you just state, or you're an expert on the history of the UN. Why was the UN so important? Why is it still so important to the world today? And what can be done to make it, enforce its principles? The importance of the UN. Why was it important when it was set up in 1945?
Well, I am very much a believer in the United Nations, a believer in the United Nations Charter, a believer in the hundreds of treaties that have been drafted by the International Law Commission and adopted by the General Assembly. I am a believer because it's the only hope of humanity. If we did not have a United Nations, we would have to create one. And the United Nations has had enormous successes in all fields of human activity. Of course, we are most sensitive to such political catastrophes as the war in Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Palestine, etc. And we see the lack of good faith, especially on the part of the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Germany. Now, I grew up in Chicago, and I remember how it was drummed into my head that we were the good guys, which by implication means that the others are the bad guys.
Hmm.
This kind of exceptionalism, this kind of arrogance is reflected in this pathetic book called The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama. This triumphalist book that makes you believe that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we in the West, we are the leaders of the world and will accept the end of history. Huh? This is it. We have won. Winner takes
Hmm.
all. But what have we done? We have mismanaged the world since 1991 in a spectacular way. There have been so many wars and so many upheavals, whether it be Yugoslavia or Afghanistan or Iraq. And if you see the voting record of the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, on almost every important resolution of the General Assembly or Security Council, we're voting wrong. Our representatives are on the wrong side of history. We're essentially voting for war. We're voting against peace. We're voting against compromise. We're voting against a modus vivendi. We just want the other guy to disappear. We are living in a world of Russophobia. I mean, the Russians, that's the enemy. A world of xenophobia, the Chinese, that's the enemy. But we perceive ourselves as the good guys. Happily, there are exceptions. I know them, they're my friends. Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University,
Hmm.
Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, Norman Solomon, Norman Finkelstein, Professor Stephen Kinzer, who wrote that fabulous book called Overthrow, from Hawaii to today, all the
Mhm.
governments in the entire world that
Mhm.
the United States has overthrown. I mean, the United States, and I like to quote Martin Luther King Jr. in his book, Why We Can't Wait. I remember reading this back in 1964 and saying, God, what is he saying? I mean, on page 141, he tells us our country, meaning the United States, was born in genocide. And then he continues. He's not talking about the Afro-Americans or slavery or segregation. He is talking about uh, the Crees and the Cherokees and the Algonquins and the Mohawks and the Iroquois. He goes on to say, our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, he should not have called them Indians because they're not Indians. They have their names. They're called Algonquins and they're called Navajos and they're called Sioux. But in any event, reading on Martin Luther King, the Indian was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore all exalt it. Our country was born in genocide. I mean, there are people who think correctly.
Mhm.
Another one is my
Professor de
friend.
Zayas, Professor de Zayas. So, would I, could we put it this way that there's been a huge lie, system of lies have been told, well, before, back to the period you're talking about, Martin Luther King, the early colonial conquest of the United States, well, North America, but certainly since the Second World War, the UN's charter, we are told that the United States is the leader of the free world, the pinnacle of democracy, the paragon of law and order. So you're saying quite bluntly that we have been fed a whole diet of lies,
Well, I'm not the
propaganda.
only one who's saying that. Just listen to Jeff Sachs and listen to Colonel McGregor and listen to Scott Ritter and listen to Jacques Bull. I mean, there's plenty of us who think that we have been lied to systematically. And the first great thinker who opened our eyes actually was Noam Chomsky, whom I
Mhm.
met in uh, Boston when he was a professor at MIT and I was a young student at Harvard University. And I adored that man. I just thought that that man had the best mind and he could, through his books, change the world. I remember his book, Manufacturing Consent, how uh, public opinion is completely manipulated in such a manner that our democracy is not democracy at all. We are living in the midst of fake news, fake history, fake law, fake democracy, fake freedom, but it is the mainstream media that tries to brainwash us into
Mhm.
believing that that's the way it is. And
Mhm.
here's someone else who's written a lot about the United Nations. This is Naomi Klein, the shock doctrine, an absolute must. a book she published back in 2007 in the light of the various financial crises caused in part by this mentality of the Bretton Woods institutions. I wrote two reports for the General Assembly, one on the World Bank and human rights, and another one on the IMF, on International Monetary Fund and human rights, and showed how they actually have undermined human rights in so many countries through their loan conditionalities, et cetera, how the name of the game was to privatize everything, to do
Hmm.
away with the idea of a safety net, the idea that governments have a responsibility for the welfare of their citizens. So, no, governments have a responsibility for war. Governments have a responsibility for the military, industrial, financial complex. That's what matters. But human rights and the rights of the poor, again, that also goes back uh, to the Calvinist idea of predetermination.
Hmm.
We are the select. God has chosen us. And if you're poor, you should be poor. God wants it that you be poor. It is
Yeah.
a very weird
Mm.
philosophy, but it underpins a lot
Yeah.
of what we see in government in the United States and in what we termed the collective West.
Mm. Professor de Zayas, I'm really, I could let you loose for hours and hours. It's fascinating. And I'm just trying to get the last few minutes in before we're cut off. I'm sorry to jump in on you like this. So, if we could just summarize, the UN, absolutely vitally important as a development in 1945, the UN Charter establishing the equality of nations, the inviolability of sovereignty, and yet it's
And the
been,
self-determination of peoples.
and
The
self-determination of
whole
people.
decolonization process goes back to
Yeah.
this idea of self-determination.
Okay. And this fantastic monumental establishment of law and rights, from what you've said, and I agree, it's been trashed, systematically, chronically trashed for 80 years. Okay, so how do we enforce law against rogue states, states that are criminal in their conduct, like the United States primarily, Israel, the other Western allies? They're lawless rogue states. How do we enforce international law and make sure that the UN Charter is upheld?
Hope is in our resolute pushing back against these abuses. We have to name and shame. We have to put things in the right place, call a spade a spade. If it's genocide, you call it genocide. If it's a crime against humanity, you call it a crimes against humanity. The global majority, otherwise known as the global South, uh, they will force the collective West
You're very
to
you're
change.
hopeful, Professor Desires. You're hopeful about the emergence of a multipolar world manifest in such fora as BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, various other.
The Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, that's what gives you hope that the global majority is rising, is asserting its uh, political power, and will eventually, in time, hold the abusers of the violators of international law to account.
Well, for the moment, what can we do? For instance, the global majority could say, you Westerners, you want to have it your way, okay, but we're not going to buy a single American automobile from you. We're not going to buy a single airplane from you. We won't buy anything from Boeing, from Lockheed Martin, from Raytheon. We're not going to buy any F-16s or F-35s from you. We're not going to buy submarines from you. We'll buy them from China. we'll buy them from Russia, we'll buy them from India, we'll buy them from somewhere else, but we're not going to finance your military industrial complex. I've always said with regard to Israel, if 50 countries, 100 countries would decide as of now, we buy nothing from Israel and we sell nothing to Israel. If you have a commercial boycott of this nature, the Israeli economy will collapse. If you divest any university that has invested in Israeli products, that could be done by the United Nations, by the way. Obviously, sanctions can only be applied by the Security Council, and the United States will hold its protecting hands over Israel. But the General Assembly has the authority to adopt a resolution called Uniting for Peace. And under this resolution that goes back to Article 12 of the UN Charter, the United Nations can tell states, we must stop the genocide in Gaza. We must hold Netanyahu accountable. So you countries have green light to do whatever you think is necessary under the responsibility to protect doctrine, paragraphs 138 and 139 of General Assembly Resolution 60-1 of 24 October 2005. Now, that means that governments would feel empowered to completely divest from Israel, and governments would feel empowered to give convoy support, military support to, for instance, the Sumud flotilla that was hijacked by, it's piracy, it's simple piracy on the part of Israel when they arrested Greta Thunberg and so many others. It is a disgrace, and it's also a disgrace the way it's been dealt with in the mainstream media in the West,
Mm.
where it is an effort of showing some kind of justification for Israel, some kind of understanding that they're doing this when it is a crime in international law. But going back to the United Nations, in my book, Building a Just World Order, I have a chapter on the necessity to democratize the United Nations, to make the United Nations representative. We're not living in 1945, we're living in 2025. 80 years have elapsed, the world is different, and we need the voice of the global majority heard. We need the presence of the global majority in the Security Council. We need the presence of senior representatives of the ideologies other than the privatization ideology of Washington and of Brussels. We need in the senior positions in the United Nations, not Americans and Brits and Germans. We
Mm.
also need Indians and Chinese and South Africans and Ugandans and Brazilians, etc.
And
One of the
Cubans
problems
and
in
Cuba, your original country, Cuba, of course.
Also, I mean, I was born in Cuba. I
Yeah.
left Cuba in 1959, and I had the pleasure of growing up in an Irish family.
Oh, yeah.
See, my uncle, born in Spain, in Oviedo, had migrated to the United States, became very wealthy, married a lovely Irish woman called Marie, who brought us up, and she came from such a big Irish family that, I mean, her brother Don had 11 kids. Her brother Bob had 7. Her brother Mike had 5. And they embraced us. We
Oh,
were part of the gang. So
yeah.
I went around wearing Kelly Green. I even had a Kelly Green bow tie. You know,
Professor Desires, look, I'm going to have to stop you there because I don't want you to be cut off in mid-sentence. What a pleasure to have you. It's been far too short, but you've covered so much for me today and or anybody listening into this. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your passion and your hope for a better world. So thank you so much, Professor Desires.
never give up.